Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about how you can make a difference for a loved one in the hospital. I'm Beth Surratt, former National Director of Marketing for BioScrip, a home infusion and home care company. I've taken the Certified Caregiving Consultant training through caregiving.com and the End-of-Life Doula training through the International End-of-Life Doula Association. I'm a family caregiver coach at the Caregiver Center at the Overlook Medical Center in New Jersey, one of only 12 such centers in the US. And I was a family caregiver for my father, John Rooney, for 5 years. That's my sister Claire, my dad, and me. My sister Claire and I were a team taking care of my dad. We learned so much that my dad wasn't in the hospital for even a single day during the entire last year of his life. We could have kept him out of the hospital more if we'd known more sooner. I wish someone had shared with me what I'm going to share with you today when my dad first landed in the hospital. And that's why I wanted to share this information with you today. This photo was taken 4 weeks before my dad passed away. When I became a family caregiver, I learned a word, a term, and a role that I never knew existed. And my journey began when I got the call. The call that said, your dad's in the hospital, in the emergency room, and you need to come down and take care of him. Okay. Apparently, he came to under the kitchen table, not knowing how he got there. He had ended up in an ambulance, went to the local Florida emergency department. He lived alone. He went to the emergency department alone. And my sister Claire and I got on a plane out of New York and arrived to the hospital in Florida, walked down the hall to see where my dad was, where they pointed us to, looked around the curtain, and the bed was empty. We looked at each other and thought, oh my gosh, is he dead? And just then, he wheeled around the corner in a wheelchair, saw us and said, hello, girls. He looked absolutely fine. We were lulled into a little bit of a false sense of security there, not knowing what was coming. And we were still completely unprepared for the discussion that followed when his doctor pulled us into the hallway. He told us without preamble that Dad had diabetes, neuropathy, and dementia. Bam, bam, bam. It felt like somebody just sort of attacked us. With that information, it was so hard to hear. I physically staggered backward at each word. So my father's mother had dementia and lived in a nursing home for 10 years, and we knew the heartbreak that meant. We were picturing my dad looking like mean old grandma in a wheelchair, barely able to speak. My sister burst into tears. I was in shock. And then I thought, wait a minute. We both visited Dad regularly, and I had called him every day at 5 o'clock in the evening ever since our mother passed away 4 years earlier. I knew he didn't have the grandma-like dementia my sister was picturing, but we needed to understand more. What really drove what happened next was a sore finger, presumably from the fall, that triggered a bone infection and a torrent of activities that went from there that included a dozen ER visits, even more hospital stays in 3 hospitals, and 8 rehabs in 3 states over 4 years. Sound exhausting? It was. Sound like another full-time job? Sometimes it was. My job grew from dutiful daughter visiting at the hospital bedside, cheering Dad up, to becoming the parent in the relationship as my father slowly regressed to become the rough equivalent of a large and very willful 6-year-old boy. You can see, my sister and I tried to find the humor in the situation, and it really did help us cope. I continually took on new responsibilities and eventually managed Dad's finances, hired, monitored, managed, and paid his home health aides, handled his legal and long-term care insurance matters. I bathed and dressed him on many occasions, which was well out of my comfort zone. I took over all the parts I could control. But there was one significant part that I couldn't control, the hospital stays. That was the part where I needed the most help, and where I, a person who loved him and knew him well, most needed to help. He needed the help because he was the most vulnerable of his entire life. He had trouble understanding accents. He had bone and urinary tract infections that rendered him practically mindless, and he suffered from sundowning, which is very disorienting, especially in the hospital. I learned that term, and many others, only because a nurse mentioned it casually one day, and it's so common in the hospital world that nobody thought to stop and explain to us that it exists, what it was, what it meant, and how we could help manage it. He also wouldn't press the red call button to alert the nurse when he needed something, not once in all of his hospital stays. So we learned that only those who knew him well could cue the hospital care team about his situation, his changes in mental status, and all of the other particulars that affected his care. He regularly, without meaning to, gave untruthful responses without meaning to or knowing that the information was inaccurate. Sometimes an infection made him completely disoriented all on its own. One day, he was looking out the hospital window at his native New York City skyline and said, "Well, it's good to be back in Boston." Not sure when the last time he was in Boston was, but I'm guessing it was 20 years before. And he just never wanted to bother the hospital staff with requests or complaints. Over those 4 years, we learned how the healthcare system works and how to make the system work for us. As I said, we had managed to keep my dad out of the hospital for about a year when he developed squamous cell cancers below both ears. So here he was, an 86-year-old widower with advanced dementia and numerous other conditions. He couldn't remember my mother, and they'd been married for 50 years. Yet one of his doctors directed us to a surgeon who wanted to perform 2 surgeries to remove the tumors. They were growing inward, and the surgeon described what would happen without the surgery: a gruesome, slow death from asphyxiation and/or starvation. That was horrible to hear. It took a few days for us to process the information because we were imagining that my dad wouldn't live through the surgeries in his condition. But how could we allow the suffering that the doctor described? We pictured all the things my dad had often talked about not wanting: a horrible experience for all, in which he dies in the hospital, in pain, attached to tubes, after unsuccessful heroics. How could we avoid that? If we didn't proceed, were we dooming him to an untimely and horrible death? Would someone actually accuse us of killing him? We called the surgeon's office for more information, and a nurse described the same situation. In a follow-up conversation with the surgeon, he said that the chance of a cure was approximately 5%. 5%. So we were done considering surgery. We didn't follow up with the surgeon, and he didn't follow up with us. One of the home health aides who helped my dad at home suggested that we see an oncologist for another point of view. At the office visit, after we explained the situation and my dad's often stated wishes, the oncologist suggested that we take my dad home to live out his remaining days as he had always wished. The doctor gave us contact information for hospice. We had no idea what hospice entailed, but a hospice nurse arrived at my dad's house that afternoon and explained everything: what hospice is, how it works, how, because my dad had Medicare Part A, it wouldn't cost him a penny, and especially important, when to use the morphine in the comfort kit that they gave us to keep in the refrigerator. We would only open the comfort kit once we felt my dad needed morphine, and the hospice nurse gave permission. I can't even begin to describe how much of a relief it was to know that my dad's life was going to end peacefully and at home, with plenty of people helping us manage the whole situation. I wrote a heartfelt note to the oncologist, thanking him for helping all of us make the most difficult decision of our entire lives at that critical moment. So how would we know when it was really the end? We had no idea. We looked to the hospice team for direction and advice. I have to tell you that hospice is the best kept, most powerful secret in healthcare. There's a whole team in place to give information about anything we could have needed. So first, we want to keep Dad comfortable. The pain and suffering that the surgeon had described was a very frightening prospect, despite the oncologist's assurances of pain management. We feared the worst, and we feared death in general because we had no experience with preparation for death or managing the final moments. My mother had passed away unexpectedly in her sleep, so none of us had any experience preparing for the end of life. We needed a lot of help. Thankfully, hospice means an enormous amount of help. Every single individual we worked with was unbelievably responsive, warm, and sympathetic. In fact, between the doctors and nurses, social workers, home health aides, chaplains, and counselors, we had people to advise us every step of the way, 24 hours a day if needed, in person if needed. The hospice doctor made house calls. When we needed a priest to perform the anointing of the sick, I made a single phone call and a priest was at my dad's door within 30 minutes. Once we realized that we had all the support we were going to need, right down to the final minutes and even afterward, we moved on to deciding how my dad would spend his remaining time. Although we told him 3 times in a couple of days what the situation was, he couldn't remember it. And he still felt pretty well, so we quickly arranged visits from family. And we had parties. We had family parties with Dad's favorite foods, including the spaghetti sauce and sloppy joes his mother and my mother had made for Dad his whole life. We had a party for the wonderful women who helped my dad manage at home for years and were honorary family members by that point. We had a lime theme for that party in honor of the gin and tonics Dad had served ever since I could remember. People always said they were the best, and they were. Dad was always proud serving them. It was quite fun. Without mentioning Dad's prognosis, we also had a huge neighborhood party that he actually remembered and talked about for weeks before and after, despite his advanced dementia. He retold the events of that party for weeks afterward to anyone he encountered, from the hospice nurses to the waiter during our regular lunches out. We had our last lunch out a week before he passed away. The next day, his energy level dropped quickly. 5 days before, he wouldn't get out of bed. 4 days before, he wouldn't eat. 3 days before, he wouldn't talk, and he seemed uncomfortable enough that the nurse agreed it was time for morphine. 3 days later, he was gone. I don't think my dad suffered at all at any time, and I believe with utter certainty that we took the right path. We have no regrets, and I will have peace of mind forever. So, you're a family caregiver. It's an imperfect healthcare system of all people doing their best, often in conditions where they're underpaid and overworked. And we all just need to work together for the common cause of helping the patient get better. So when you're in the hospital, I sort of organized this information to show the 3 great ways to manage your loved one's health, 3 great ways to help prevent common mistakes, and 3 great ways to keep your loved one from returning to the hospital. So this is an overview. There's no need to remember all of this information now. You can definitely come back along the way to the different sections as you need it. And I'll start with the most important jobs in the hospital. The doctor's job, which is making medical decisions, the nurse's job, which is caring for patients and giving medications, and your job. First is really sharing goals and information about your loved one. You want to look at it regarding the minimal time that your loved one would spend in the hospital, and maximum time at home, of course, minimal pain and maximum mobility. You, as a family, want to understand whether your loved one wants to extend life no matter what, whether he or she values quality over quantity or quantity over quality. Is there something that your loved one wants to particularly live for? A wedding, a birth, see their children grow up. Are they very concerned about not being a burden? And what's the best way to achieve all of these things, given all of the options and their varying likelihood of helping when there's a critical illness? Your job is also to keep track of things. There is so much to keep track of. There's no way, certainly the hospital patient can keep track of it. And even a family member paying full attention 24/7 couldn't keep track of it all without writing it down. So get a notebook, write it down, and it will really help you notice different trends, anything that might be unusual, anything that might warrant some questions or concerns. It will help you and your family make decisions, having all the information that you need, looking back at it to help understand the different things that have happened along the way. And it will help you as you prepare for discharge, because the more you know, the better prepared you are, the less likely that your loved one will end up being readmitted to the hospital. Next, we'll talk about 3 great ways to manage your loved one's health in the hospital. First, understand the power that you have as a family caregiver. When I was taking care of my dad, I would introduce myself to anybody who came in the room, get their name and what their job was, what their role was, and write it down. I would say, I'm the family caregiver. I'll be keeping track and helping make decisions in my dad's care. I hope that you'll consider me part of the care team, and I definitely want to be part of the discussions about his care. I explained all the things about my dad, including the fact that he really was not wise in the ways of anything healthcare. My mother had been a nurse and took care of all those types of things. And I explained that I could fill them in on all these important details, that he has dementia, but he'll fool you because he covers really well. He's not deaf, he just can't handle the accents. His alcohol use, he would describe as 2 drinks an evening, but his 2 drinks were about 6 ounces of alcohol. That he didn't have depression, despite what some people sometimes thought. That he lives alone, but he has help. And about what's important to him. And I would ask, do I need to sign a form so that I can have his medical information and give you information about him? Do other family members need to fill out a form? So my sister and I both filled out a form so that doctors could speak with either one of us about his care. Also, you want to ask the best way to give and get information. What's the best way to reach each other? What's the best way to involve your backup and reach your backup? What should we hit the call button for when we're in the room, and what should we not hit the call button for? When are rounds? When does the doctor see all the patients, and how can we arrange to be there? Do you have a form for an advance directive? How do we fill that out and get that into the record? We would discuss with each doctor, who would make decisions if my dad couldn't. And we had that discussion with my dad present so that the doctor understood that we were all on the same page. We discussed things like the do not resuscitate order that my dad had wanted to have, and what we would do in the case that it looked like he needed to be intubated and put on mechanical ventilation. If he was nearing the end of life, would they give antibiotics and tube feeding or IV feeding if he was unable to eat? So luckily, we had discussed a lot of this along the way with my dad for many years after his experience with my grandmother. I definitely recommend having these discussions along the way. As challenging as they are to have, it really helps. You don't want to be in a position where your loved one is in the ICU with emotions running high and no time to think things through and making decisions that somebody might regret. We also were very aware of what my dad wanted versus what we wanted. Luckily, we were pretty much on the same page, but there are definitely family situations where those are very different things. And patients sometimes make decisions based on what the family wants rather than what the patient wants. And that's just always something to be aware of. And when we were really not sure about what to do in a certain situation, we would ask the doctor, what would you do if it was your father? So that puts the doctor into a little bit of a tough position. And no matter what, it's not his father, and so it may not be the actual decision he would make in that case. And we understood that and explained that. And most often, the doctor would answer, and that really helped us make a decision. We might not make the same decision he would have made, but we understood what he would have done and why, and that really helped. When you're in the hospital, ask all the different doctors and nurses you're working with, how can we make your job easier? You want to build a rapport with them. You want to be positive and polite, acknowledge their workload and their hard work, tell their supervisor good things when they happen and not just the negative things. Most hospitals have a system where you can fill out a form to tell the administration about the good things the nurses or doctors are doing. And I'll tell you one thing that really won nurses over was food and candy. So we brought lots of that. We just wanted to show our appreciation, and they appreciated that. You also want to have a family member stay with your loved one as often as possible. My sister and I were very lucky in that at least one of us stayed with him most days, all day. We, I think, topped it out at 18 hours one day. But that was us, and it's not so easy for everybody to do that. So the notebook that we started really helped. When one of us was there, we would fill out whatever happened so that when the other one was there, they could see what happened. We wrote down who came to visit and occasionally put a visitor to work, keeping notes for us when we weren't there. We wrote down all our questions and prioritized them so we could be brief and get to the point when we were talking to doctors and nurses, all of whom have very limited time because they have lots of patients to care for. We made sure that we were there to discuss test results, the daily plan of care, check the meals, note when he didn't get the diabetic meal that he needed or the low sodium meal that he needed. It's easy to mix up orders on a food tray, so we just kept tabs and made notes. We kept the nurses informed. So it's very hard to bring up things to the nurse that the nurse really needs to be aware of. Things about the patient's appetite or thirst or sleeping, things that the patient probably wouldn't think to mention to the nurse, but that all can have a big effect on the care and the recovery. Are they having trouble balancing, getting to the bathroom? And what my sister and I called the 4 Ps, telling the nurses, keeping them informed about pain, bowel movements, urination, and vomiting. And the 4 Ps version was pain, poop, pee, and puke. But these were all things that it's very difficult to bring up to the nurse, and they really have such an impact on what happens during the hospital stay. Next, we'll talk about 3 great ways to prevent common hospital mistakes. Ask everyone to wash their hands. That's number 1. Most people will do this when they come into the room, certainly anybody who works in the hospital, but it's easy to forget when you're very busy. It is so important because 1 in 25 patients in the US, in hospitals throughout the US, gets a new infection while in the hospital. Hand washing is the best prevention. Common hospital mistakes can lead to complications, unnecessary side effects, longer stays, and simple hand washing can prevent so much of that. You also want to review all of the medications daily. They can change. The most common hospital mistakes are medication errors. You want to look for medications that have been added, stopped, changed, might be missing, or duplicated, you realize. You want to check the pill colors and shapes every time the nurse brings them. Are they the same as before? You want to check the dosage and the side effects and allergies. We had a couple of times in 2 days in a row where 2 different nurses brought my dad a bag of sucrose, that they hung even though he has diabetes. And I said, that can't be right? And then she went and checked, and in fact, it wasn't right. So it's just easy to make a simple mistake like that, and the more eyes watching, the better. You also want to look for antidepressants, whether the patient was taking antidepressants before arriving at the hospital or whether they were prescribed in the hospital. They may or may not really be necessary. Again, the doctor may not realize that Your loved one doesn't need it, but you may be able to explain why your loved one wouldn't need it. On the other hand, you definitely want to beware of depression. It can set in the hospital. It can make lots of things worse. And a lot of times with existing depression or new depression, treating the depression enables the patient to handle all of the other situations better and get better faster. Sometimes an antidepressant can actually worsen sundowning, which is when patients become disoriented around sundown. And you definitely want to keep an eye out for any connection there. So we talked about taking notes, and you definitely want to ask questions and write down the answers in your notes. Whenever you see something or that just doesn't make sense, or have questions about something, just to make sure you understand what's going on, definitely ask. And whenever anything really transpires, when you meet a new doctor, you want to write down the name, the condition the doctor treats, their contact information. You want to write down everything that happens in terms of an evaluation, a diagnosis, a plan of care for each day. As I said, the medications, any side effects you suspect or are sure of, any tests scheduled, test results, complications. This will really help you get insights into what's happening and really help you notice when something is wrong. This is especially helpful during transitions. Entering the emergency room, going from the emergency room to a floor when the patient is admitted, going in and out of ICU where there's lots going on, moving from one floor to another for whatever reason, during changes in doctors' shifts, to keep track of all the different things that different doctors are telling you based on their viewpoint from their specialty, and all of the different nursing shifts. So writing it all down helps you get a great view and helps with consistency of care. Again, if something doesn't seem right, just ask. Could you help me understand something? And if you're not quite comfortable with the answer you get from one person, you can ask another. You'll always get some additional little piece of information when you ask the same question to a couple of different people. Next, we'll talk about 3 great ways to keep your loved one from returning to the hospital. Talk with the discharge planner early. Ask the nurse, what's the best way to meet with the discharge planner? The discharge planner is a person who coordinates all of the care needed to discharge the patient, gets all the doctors to sign off, makes sure that all the medications that need to be prescribed are in the record. And you can meet with the discharge planner either in the room to have a discussion with the patient, or you might want to ask to meet in the discharge planner's office so that you can have a little privacy and maybe talk about things you don't want to mention in front of the patient. You definitely also want to bring your notebook. You want to write down what information you're going to need about prescriptions and ask for the prescriptions themselves so that you can fill them before discharge. Generally what happens is you get the prescriptions as part of the discharge, then you get your loved one home and somebody needs to run to the pharmacy to get them filled. It's much easier to manage everything if you can get the medications beforehand. You also get the opportunity to take the medications home and organize them in some way so that the medication regimen and any other treatment that's going to need to be done at home is set up on a schedule and everybody's ready when your loved one gets home. You definitely want to ask about hands-on training for any wound care that you may have, injections you may need to give, or anything of that nature. You also want to understand the types of things when you get home, what you should be looking for in terms of good progress and problems. What should you call about? What should you not call about? Who is it you should call? When You ask for the discharge details. You also want to ask about nursing care at home. Will any nursing care be provided? If your loved one is a veteran, you can look at veterans benefits. They often have care that can be provided at home for little or no cost. You also want to look into benefits if your loved one is working, what the benefits are through work that you or your loved one may not have been aware of because you never needed them before. You also want to keep your primary care physician, the patient's primary care physician, in the loop. Tell that doctor what the plan of care is for going home and mention that if he or she has any helpful advice, you would love to hear it. You want to make sure that discharge details are complete. There's so much information coming from so many doctors and nurses that the discharge planner needs to put together. When you receive all that information, you want to review it and make sure there's nothing missing. See if you have any questions. You want to talk about supplies that you'll need at home, whether you'll be going home with any of them and where you can purchase them after you get home. And then we're going to talk about 3 ways to prepare when the care plan becomes an end-of-life plan. There are 3 critical things to ask about if time becomes short: pain management, palliative care, and hospice. First, you want to tell family members time may be short, and likely you're going to need help, especially if you've been the primary caregiver along the way. Tell them, I'm overwhelmed and I need your help. Assign specific tasks, get them to agree to it, and to commit to following through. For pain management, you definitely want to ask your physician, do we need a pain management specialist? Pain can be very hard to manage, and a specialist can be especially effective in helping manage it. You want to ask about palliative care. Palliative care is not just for people at the end of life, but it is especially helpful then. It's about anticipating, preventing, and treating suffering, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, or any other type of aspect. You want to ask, do you have palliative care specialists? And they'll help you manage before you need hospice and until you actually enroll in hospice. Hospice is usually handled at home or sometimes in a facility, depending on the situation. It also addresses the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. It provides counseling, medications, equipment, and supplies for the patient and support for family caregivers, especially regarding how to handle crises along the way. Hospice is for patients who are terminally ill or have a terminal injury where life expectancy is less than 6 months. You get a whole new team of doctors and nurses. The approach moves from treating a condition or an illness to cure it to focusing on comfort until the end of life. They can help address all kinds of questions like when to give food or water, or when not to give food or water. All types of questions about what care to help you make a decision about when to end treatment and move on to just providing comfort. A lot of people don't know about hospice until it's too late for it to do the most good. You definitely want to inquire about hospice on the early side. Learn what it is, learn what's available, and be prepared to say to your doctor, it's time for hospice, because your doctor might not say it to you. Studies actually suggest that people live longer with hospice and have a better quality of life, that it's less stressful for family caregivers, and that after the fact, family caregivers suffer from less depression than when hospice is not used. It is a great program. You also want to think about what's important to your loved one and focus on that. For you, it's easier to manage when you're prepared in advance and know what to expect. Know what's important to your loved one. It may be something you never realized before. You want to talk to your loved one about meaning and legacy and preparing for the final days. Some of the most meaningful time ever is when you know your time is limited and you want to make the most of it. People often want to resolve conflicts in the family, say things that have been unsaid, provide forgiveness, or close unfinished business. As family caregivers, we often want to thank the person, because often it's a parent or whoever else it may be, and tell that person what she or he has meant to you in your life. You want to have no regrets for your loved one and no regrets for you. In terms of creating a legacy, we at the end of life often reflect on our entire lives and want to pass on our collected wisdom. A great way to do this is to create a legacy project. It's a legacy in a physical form. You can create videos and or audio, letters, scrapbooks, baskets of things. It's helpful to everyone to process and prepare for the very end. And it helps people focus on the time left and to give purpose to that time. In planning for the final actual days, it is helpful to learn about the signs and symptoms to understand whether it looks like it might be another couple of weeks or tomorrow or in a couple of hours. You may want to see if your loved one is interested in guided imagery, what they feel about physical contact when they're alert and when they're not alert. You may want to get their ideas about medications, when and if they want to stop some of them or all of them. You want to talk about the spiritual elements of the final days and the physical care. Who will provide it? How many people will provide it? Are there people who definitely are requested to provide it? Are there some where it's just better off to not have those people involved in the physical care? There are a lot of logistics. Do you want to hire a private nurse? Do you have hospice? How does that work? You can ask your doctors and nurses for their thoughts on the final days and do research on your own. You may want to have an end-of-life doula to help you through, somebody who's experienced in these situations. Preparation definitely helps reduce stress. Even if it's to expect the unexpected, which we all should, but you want to ask the care team what to expect. Ask them if there's anyone you can talk to with expertise in this area. Clergy are especially helpful. You could actually ask to talk to a bereavement specialist, and that's somebody who helps people after they've lost a loved one, but they certainly have the most knowledge about what people think after the fact and how they avoid regret, deal with regret after the fact, and can help you prepare your loved one and your family so that you don't have regret. And then there's the platform. This is my take on managing stress. I picture life as a roller coaster, and at the edge of that roller coaster is a big, sturdy platform. In each different car, there are your loved one, your boss, your spouse, your children, the doctors and nurses, all the different people you encounter in the average day. The idea is they're in the car, but you never get in the car. You stay on the platform. You talk to them from the platform. You invite them to your platform, but you don't get on the roller coaster with them, and you just stay on the platform. The idea is not to disengage, just to disentangle to help you cope with all the things going on in your mind. So remember, you are a family caregiver, and you can make a difference at every step of the way for your loved one. In summary, the key 3 takeaways are: ask questions until you understand everything that you need to understand. Write it all down so that you can keep track and notice trends or issues and prepare for what's next. And as much as possible, stay on the platform. I hope all this information will make it easier for you to manage the hospital stay for a loved one. In the free guide that you see here, there's much of this information, and you can download it for free from my website, havehealth.net. And I invite you to connect with me on Twitter. You can see my Twitter handle here, Beth Surratt, or feel free to call me, email me, or tweet. I also have a limited supply of free printed guides, which I'm happy to share. The website has a lot more information and a lot of resources that may help you in the future. I wish you all the best in your caregiving, and thank you again for joining me today.